Want to tap on that microphone? Be the one that starts it off? Okay, he's going to start off. You can just give me a thumbs up whenever you're going to start.
Speak for you. It's not live. We'll turn it on when we're ready.
Okay, and I just speak into it.
Just like a normal microphone.
It seems to work.
We are good as soon as you'd like to.
Oh, okay.
No rush, no rush.
Yeah.
But we're ready.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's so good to see all of you here this lovely summer day or almost summer day. I want to thank you all for being here in person and also for joining online here at the Narragansett Bay campus. As we do at the University of Rhode Island, we begin with a land acknowledgement that the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. And I'm really pleased to welcome you all here this evening for Metcalf Institute's 4th annual Leeson Lecture, which honors Robert Leeson, a longtime advisory board member for the Metcalf Institute. He's been a tremendous advocate and a generous supporter of the Institute's mission. And in honor of Rob, a group of more than 140 donors endowed the annual Robert Leeson Jr. Lecture. So this lecture series has really allowed the Metcalf Institute to bring an incredible guest lecture series to URI, including our speaker this evening, people from across the country to discuss topics of pressing global importance. And so tonight we're going to hear about fossil fuels and their impact on our climate. And as many of you saw last week, there was the NOAA report that carbon dioxide levels are continuing, if you follow the Keeling curve, and they are more than 50% higher than they were before the onset of the industrial era. And so inevitably, of course, and we're in the process of doing that, we have to adapt to unavoidable climate impacts, but we really must make every effort to slash carbon pollution and safeguard our planet. So we're going to hear tonight about the need to accelerate our transition to a future built on clean energy. And we're going to find out how important it is to ensure that this transition does not leave people behind or benefit the few at the expense of many. And so that's the theme of the Institute's lecture series this year: what is needed for an equitable, clean energy transition. And so here at the University of Rhode Island, many of our faculty, staff, and students are working to better understand the impact of climate change and how to help communities respond. And it's so important that we talk about this and broadly share this with journalists, the public, fellow researchers, industry, and the government. And highlighting and sharing this work obviously informs decision and policy making, and we can tell the story with evidence-based research. And so the Metcalf Institute is a key player in this communication, both here at the University of Rhode Island and around the world. And so I'm so pleased to be here tonight to now have the honor to introduce Sunshine Menendez, who is the Metcalf Institute Director, and she is going to share more about the Institute's work and tonight's guest speaker. Sunshine, thank you.
Counteracting microphones there. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, President Parlange. And thank you again to Rob Leeson for his dedication to Metcalf Institute's mission, and to all the people who contributed to the Leeson Lecture to make this event possible. This year marks a full quarter century that Metcalf Institute has been advancing public conversations about climate change and other environmental issues. And we have done this in a variety of ways, but the very first of our programs was a science immersion workshop for journalists. And so this year, we are really pleased to welcome the 25th class of fellows in that program. Would you all raise your hands for a second? Big shout out to all these incredible fellows who we're so pleased to welcome to campus, especially since this is our first in-person workshop since 2019. So this one is especially fantastic. But we're also really excited because we have many other alumni in town this evening for this celebration of the 25th anniversary. So thanks to all of you for being here too. Over the last 25 years, our offering we went on to this training for journalists, and then we added communication training for scientists. I can say, as a proud alum of the Graduate School of Oceanography, I learned a great deal about oceanography, but at the time, not that much about communication. And so Metcalf Institute has made an effort to really engage researchers, not just at the University of Rhode Island, but all around the country to improve our communication practices. Oops. And now our bagpipe intermission. I will note that we have added other programs, but I will skip for the sake of time. Our work is invaluable for solving pressing global challenges. And there is an ever greater need and, in fact, an ever greater demand for the training that Metcalf Institute does. And to this point, I hope that you will take a moment today or before you leave to make a gift in support of Metcalf Institute on this big milestone for us, to help us meet that demand for critical training. And to inspire your giving, I'm pleased to note that we have a dollar for dollar matching opportunity. Thank you to a very generous group of donors. So up to $12,500 additional giving this month, we'll have a one-to-one match. Just to give you a little public radio spin on your support of Metcalf Institute. Your support helps us do public programs like this, as well as all of the training that we do, and creates those conversations that will ultimately move people to action on environmental issues like climate change, like the clean transition. If you're online, you can take a second to click on the link in the chat, or if you're here in person, you can grab a reply envelope on your way out. So let me tell you about today's Leeson Lecture. We have heard more and more about the clean energy transition. Maybe you've heard the term decarbonization or some other sort of jargony language. Those of you who've been tuning into our lectures this month have perhaps already heard a number of perspectives on this process of moving toward a clean energy future. But we don't often hear what this looks like in the near future in a very comprehensive and understandable way. The transition to a carbon-free society requires changes in policy, in infrastructure, in our daily habits, and in many, many other details. We need to ensure that services remain safe and reliable, while also implementing change at a truly massive scale. During this period of change, from conception of new ideas through implementation, we need to create systems that allow for everyone's social, economic, and environmental well-being. Today's speaker calls this near-term change the mid-transition. Dr. Emily Grubert is an associate professor of sustainable energy policy, civil and environmental engineering, and earth sciences at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Grubert is a civil engineer and environmental sociologist who studies how we can make better decisions about large infrastructure systems. She's particularly interested in just approaches to decarbonization in the US energy system. To do that, Dr. Grubert studies the so-called life cycle impacts of social or environmental impacts, that is, of decarbonization policies and infrastructure, and how community and societal priorities can be better incorporated into those policy and project decisions. She uses a wide variety of qualitative and quantitative methods to do this, which you will hear more about today. And she formerly served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Carbon Management in the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management. She oversaw their carbon management program, the carbon management is a very important part of this story, which works to minimize the climate and environmental impacts of fossil energy through different technologies. And with that, I am very pleased to welcome Dr. Emily Grubert.
Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate everybody being here tonight, and I'm honored to be here. I think to this point about decarbonization maybe being a term you've heard before. If you haven't, you're going to hear it a lot tonight. But I'm really excited to talk tonight a little bit about what it looks like when we really start to think about practically and infrastructurally, physically, what happens as we start to get toward these concepts of a clean energy future, decarbonization, net zero, and those types of things. So kind of the overall point that I hope people take away from this is we are starting from a set of infrastructures that we need to completely remake. And that gives us a massive, massive opportunity to remake it intentionally and to focus on justice at the same time as we're focusing on a lot of climate stuff. But let's go on that journey, and thank you again for being here tonight. So to start off, this is maybe kind of an obvious point, but the energy system that we have is changing. And there are a bunch of reasons for that. One of the primary drivers for this, both in the United States and globally, is the goal of decarbonizing or taking the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, out of the system as a response to climate change. Energy globally and in the United States, actually, it's pretty consistent everywhere, is still about 80% fossil fueled. And that number has been pretty stable for decades. And so when we start thinking about what it means to really transform this, we're at the very, very beginning of a pretty significant project. At the same time as we need to change kind of structurally what the energy system actually is, we also need to think about not just climate change and the impact that that has on the infrastructures that we're talking about. So power plants have a hard time when it's hot, droughts have big issues, those types of things, but also the fact that energy access remains a really challenging problem globally. A lot of people don't have access to energy services at all. And particularly under climate change, we anticipate that the kinds of energy services people will need will likely become more intensive. So air conditioning being kind of the classic example here, where just the fact that it's getting hotter means we will actually need more energy to keep people safe. So against all of these backdrops, we have a huge amount of work to do. Let's just illustrate this a little bit. This is a US example, but again, the broad outlines are actually pretty consistent globally. This green line, if you look kind of from 1950 up to 2022, shows fossil energy consumption in the United States. This is quadrillion BTUs, which is not a unit that people use outside energy studies in the United States, I think, but main point is we use about 100 of these units. That's been stable for a few decades. About 80 of those units come from fossil fuels. The other two, The other two objects on here kind of show nuclear energy and renewable energy. So this blue line shows nuclear electric power consumption in the United States over the last 70 years or so. It's been pretty stable since the 1970s when we really built out the nuclear industry. That has not changed much. A lot of those plants are coming up on end of life, which is a really significant policy conversation I won't get into tonight, but basically pretty small, but pretty stable. The one that I think people are often surprised by is this orange line, which is total renewable energy consumption, is actually also pretty stable over the last 70 years. When we talk about climate change and when we talk about the energy transition, a lot of that conversation really focuses on this big growth of renewable energy. That's true, and I'll show that in a second. I already teased that by accident, but one of the things that I think is really important to recognize is how small of a base we're starting from. So there is growth, you can see that growth, but largely this historically going back is hydropower, which we've had for a long time, and biomass. So wood, increasingly ethanol, things like that. But all of those things together, plus the kind of more typical wind and solar types of energies are all in this little tiny line. So that's the line that we need to kind of take over this whole part and then probably add to account for these new energy demands. And again, this is a US-focused example, but this is broadly pretty similar globally. Looking specifically at renewable energy, I always think that this chart is kind of interesting too, because it's not necessarily intuitive to people based on what we talk about. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is too. But looking back again from 1950 until last year, you see the blue line first is hydropower. That has been relatively stable with some fluctuation. The fluctuation is largely due to water year outcomes. So if there's a drought one year, you have less hydropower. But we essentially stopped building dams in the United States for a couple of reasons. One, that we used up all the good sites. The other, that we realized that dam building is actually extraordinarily destructive in a lot of different ways. So hydropower is not really growing. You see a little bit of refurbishing at existing dams, that kind of stuff, but that's pretty stable. This red line shows biomass, which I think is the other one that's kind of surprising to people. So that's wood largely, but then around 2005, where you see this kind of takeoff, that is the ethanol mandate. For people that are familiar with that, basically we decided as a policy goal around 2005 that we were going to use ethanol largely from corn to blend in with gasoline for vehicles. So cars usually don't run on pure ethanol, but when you go to a gas station, there's some ethanol in that. So that's basically what all that growth is for biomass. Then the kind of interesting ones, I think this is actually extremely confusing, and I've even mentioned it to the organization that makes this chart, but yellow on this chart is wind, not solar. But you can kind of see around 2005, wind really starts to kick up, and you get that exponential growth. Solar follows pretty close behind. Around 2011, you start to see that exponential kick. That's a big part of the reason why we talk about solar and wind as these kind of resources of the future that are really starting to take off. This is also kind of the backbone of what a lot of people expect the future energy economy to be built on. The other one down here, this orange, is geothermal, which is basically the Earth's heat. You don't really see a kickoff there yet, but there's a lot of expectations that we may start to see that one go exponential at some point in the near term as well. A lot of advantages of geothermal, like it's not weather dependent, things like that. But these are kind of the modern renewables, is what a lot of people call them. And they're the ones that we expect to really take off. But again, going back to this overall chart, we're starting from a real small base and essentially saying we need to retire all of this. Nuclear probably is going to retire as well, because again, these plants are 70 years old in some cases. And then we got to take this line, which is at this point mostly ethanol and hydropower, to make these little guys big. Huge, huge transition, and something that I think is hard to grasp sometimes, that this is really not a marginal change. This is a complete restructuring of the way we think about energy systems. This also accompanies a general shift to mostly electricity-based services, because that's how we make wind and solar into energy we can use, away from kind of a mix of electricity and things like gasoline, natural gas, those types of things. Huge fundamental undertaking. This requires new governance structures, new institutional structures, new ways we measure energy, all these types of things. But it also presents this really massive opportunity to be very intentional about how we design our infrastructure. The hard part is you have to do this all at the same time as actually bringing the other pieces down. All right, so why is the energy system changing? Essentially, I think this audience is probably quite familiar with this point, but the climate is changing. This is the big reason why we're really talking about decarbonization and taking fossil fuels out of the energy system. It's interesting, you can make a lot of arguments that are not climate for why you might want to transition away from fossil fuels anyway, but climate change is really the main reason that we're talking about this. This is an image from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I know it's kind of small, but I think the big point that I want to make here is essentially we are already committed to quite a lot of climate change. That looks like some very specific types of outcomes. So warming being a big one, sea acidification, those types of things. But then a really big change in not only the average kind of temperatures and precipitations that we experience, but also the extremes. So this changes our normals. It also changes our disasters. And it is something that we really need to think a lot about as we plan for what these infrastructures actually need to be able to do. We're at already about 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming. And what we do now and over the next several decades essentially dictates how much further we go. That, I think, is also a really big point, because as we talk about essentially taking fossil fuels out of the energy system, because again, they are the single biggest contributor to both historic and ongoing climate change, that's really those kinds of decisions and the pace of how fast we do that is really what determines whether we end up at 2, 3, 4, and these different kinds of impacts associated with that. So lots and lots of opportunities to stave off some really, really negative impacts, but we're already committed to a lot of climate change as well. This is interesting, not just from a pace of transition perspective, but also from a design of systems perspective, because again, this is a really dynamic thing. We don't know exactly where we're going to land, and we don't know exactly what the impacts are. So as you design a new set of infrastructures, you have to be conscious of the fact that they are going to be operating in increasingly dynamic environments. I do want to kind of reflect on some extreme events and also make the point really directly. I think a lot of the time we see in communications context that we are trying to stave off the worst impacts of climate change. For a lot of people, the worst impacts of climate change are already here. We can stave off how many people have to experience those, but this is already something that's really significant. So this image is a wildfire a few years ago that's really close to my hometown, which is why I chose this one. But we already see people losing their lives, their homes, species are going extinct. This is something that's already happening. As another example, this is flooding in Pakistan in 2022. This killed 900 people, influenced about 30 million people, and was called by their climate change minister a climate-induced humanitarian disaster of epic proportions. These are the kinds of things we're already experiencing. And so when we think about, what's the point of why are we doing this and all of that kind of thing, this is something that we're already committed to. And what we choose to do largely with the energy system kind of dictates how far this goes. Another concept I want to spend a little bit of time talking about now too is this notion of most affected people and areas, or MAPA. This is a term that really tries to encapsulate the point that not everyone is affected equally by climate change. We know increasingly that everyone is affected, but many people are unable to respond in quite the same ways, oftentimes because of kind of an active set of decisions and a long, long history of very specific, very exclusionary actions over decades or centuries that result in some people and places having much less ability to respond, oftentimes when they are also the least responsible for climate change. So as we think about transforming these infrastructures around climate change because of climate change, and really thinking about the opportunities we have to design for justice, really accounting for the fact that there's already a massive amount of injustice built into the system and that there is a lot we need to correct, I think is pretty important to keep in mind as well. And then finally, just thinking about exactly what this looks like and to kind of bring that point home about the choices we make now being really pretty impactful over the next several decades. This is another image from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, essentially showing we're here, and then where we end up in the future is pretty dependent on the choices that we make now. That's something where, again, we have a large amount of control. There are a lot of things we can do now that basically dictate where we end up, but also kind of shows, even in a circumstance where we do a massive, massive amount of work to very, very quickly transition, we're still committing to a dynamic set of increasing climate impacts over the next several decades. Again, really thinking about what that means for infrastructure, how we design to put people first, how we design to make sure that many of these impacts are things that we can accommodate if they're different from what we expect. Those types of things are difficult to think about from an engineering perspective and many other perspectives, but really very important. All right, so with all of this, the world is actually committing to quite a bit of action on climate change. I think kind of incredibly, something that is a little harder to find the specific statistic on than you would think it would be, but we actually are still seeing emissions rising. There's a lot of conversations about obviously bringing emissions down, those types of things, and really trying to focus on getting to lower climate impacts into the future. Emissions are still rising, even though we've known that this is potentially a result of fossil fuel use for over a century. We've been talking about it from a policy perspective for decades. Emissions are still going up. But increasingly, we actually do see people at least talking about and making statements about action. I know this one's small again, but just kind of illustratively, something like 88% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered on a country level by a net zero target. And I'll talk about what that means again a little bit in a second. But if you zoom in really far on this one, what you see pretty quickly is that very, very few of those commitments are actually legally binding, and very few of them are associated with a process for getting there, which is a little bit challenging. But to kind of bring this home, in 2019, something like 73% of global emissions were covered by a net zero target. As of 2022, it's closer to 88%. So on a national level, at least, committing to net zero emissions is increasingly kind of expected and something that we do see a lot in climate conversations. So just to kind of talk about what net zero means for a second, because I think it's important as we think about pace of transition, what the infrastructure transition means, all those types of things. This essentially means that your ongoing emissions are counterbalanced by greenhouse gas removals. That's something that I'm not going to get into a ton today. It's something I worked on a lot while I was at DOE. But basically, the idea is you take greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere, either through chemical means or sometimes biological means. These are extraordinarily resource-intensive processes. They're doable, but they're extraordinarily resource-intensive. If you're talking about trees, for example, it is a permanent commitment of land use, which has a lot of sovereignty issues associated with it, those types of things, and you can't actually get quite as much carbon as we're talking about in some of these conversations. For things like direct air capture with storage, this is very, very energy intensive. So doable, but it's the kind of thing where we're really looking at a precious resource that we need to reserve for the most difficult types of emissions that we need to offset. So not so much a coal-fired power plant, but more nitrous oxide emissions from agriculture or something where you really kind of need that emission to keep going so that we can continue to feed people. But kind of the point behind these net zero targets is because there's generally not a specified implementation pathway, and because these are not legally binding, a lot of the time the conversation stays very, very nebulous about, maybe we can continue to use a lot of fossil, we'll counterbalance it with a lot of removals, we'll get to net zero, and so we don't really need to get into the specifics. I think a big point that I would like to leave you with tonight is essentially that when we talk about net zero, given all of the kinds of things that are caught up with how hard removals are, who is owed removals, those types of things. This is possible, but we should reserve it for the hard stuff. So given that the fossil phase out piece of it is actually relatively easy compared to many of these other greenhouse considerations, really, when people are talking about net zero commitments, we're talking about getting as close to zero as possible, and that means getting rid of the stuff that's actually causing emissions. So basically, when you are committing to a net zero target, you're essentially saying, I'm going to retire a massive amount of infrastructure, but we're not quite talking about that yet. All right, so I'm going to switch over to this side for a moment just to talk a little bit about US goals in particular. So I mentioned a minute ago that many of the goals that we're talking about with kind of global net zero goals are not legally binding. That's true in the United States as well. So in the US, by executive order through the Biden-Harris administration, we are committed to a goal of 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. That's pretty fast. That's 12 years, 3 presidential terms, essentially. Kind of an unpopular opinion. I actually do think this is physically possible, but we are not on a path to make it happen. And part of that is not just because it means building a lot of stuff, taking out a lot of stuff, but also because it means a lot of kind of social support infrastructure that's really necessary to make sure that this transition can happen. But I do think this is still possible. The other big goal that is the part that's in those net zero targets is that we are committed by that same executive order to net zero emissions economy-wide by 2050. What that means is electricity, but also things like transportation, industrial fuel use, and a lot of other industrial processes that are not necessarily fossil fuel based. So most of the greenhouse gas emissions that we see are fossil fuel based, but there's some exceptions like CO2 from calcining cement, things like that, nitrous oxide from agriculture, mostly from fertilizer use, and then like methane from cattle and stuff like that. But in general, when we're talking about a net zero goal, this is for everything that's causing an emission, potentially offset by some of the carbon dioxide removal. So these are our goals. Again, we don't really have a super clear pathway to getting there. And traditionally, at least over the last decade or so, the United States has really focused on creating incentives to build clean stuff and has not talked quite as much about what it means to take out the infrastructure that's actually causing the emissions, which can be a little challenging when we think about what the pathway actually looks like. So what does that mean infrastructurally? I love maps. I'm a civil engineer and I love maps, and so I'm going to subject you to a few. But so this one is going to have the same legend as the next slide, so let me walk you through it for a second. But basically, this is a map as of 2018 data of all of the fossil fuel-fired electricity generation in the United States. Red dots are natural gas-fired power plants. Blacks, browns, and gray dots are different kinds of coal-fired power plants. And then these little green ones that you see mostly in the Northeast are oil-fired. We don't actually use a ton of oil for electricity in the United States, but we do use some. But that's what those little green dots are. On the counties and county equivalents, The golds are essentially how much labor you see associated with the power plants themselves. The pinks are natural gas labor, and then the grays are coal labor. So this is essentially a map of all of the fossil fuel-fired power plants and all of the labor associated with maintaining those as of kind of a 2018 snapshot. This doesn't show a lot of the other support infrastructure that is required for these things. So wells, rail, pipelines, those types of things. But effectively, if you look at this, this is the set of infrastructure that needs to be retired or very substantially modified in the next 12 years if we're going to achieve that goal. I'm going to let this run a couple times. Again, this shares a legend with the last figure, but I think one of the things that is kind of interesting when you start to look at infrastructure from a question of how do we actually reach the goals that we've set for ourselves. It's like, let's assume we succeed. What does that actually mean right now? Is that you can really start to investigate where there are potentially opportunities to leverage conditions on the ground. A really nice thing about talking about retirements is that we know where these things are. We know who works there. We know how many pensions they need. We know who has a mortgage they need to pay. We know tax revenues, all that type of stuff. And so you could look at a pretty high specificity and say, what are the expectations for this infrastructure that helps you get pretty precise and pretty concrete about activities. So what this is showing essentially is if you assumed each of those power plants lasted as long as power plants using the same fuel and the same technology typically have, which is actually a really kind of remarkably stable number. It's about 30 years for non-steam plants and about 50 years for steam plants with a little bit of variability by fuel. When would you expect them to close? That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to close then, but sort of in a conversation about, are we forcing these things to close early? What would people expect about how long a job might last or how long a facility might last? This gives you kind of a first estimate of when stuff kind of reaches end of life. And what's kind of remarkable about this is that if you watch for like the 2035 dates, the 2050 dates, it turns out that a lot of our infrastructure is already past its expected lifetime, but essentially almost all of it will have reached its expected lifetime by that 2035 date. There's only about 15% of plant years and job years that haven't reached end of life within the fossil system by 2035. Why that's important is partially because it really helps us, I think, be precise about when we're asking a plant to close early, which is pretty important from a lot of policy and legal standpoints, just in terms of liability, takings, those types of things, but also in thinking about what would a normal system look like and how can we actually plan around this. So thinking about kind of starting from the point that you're not actually forcing a lot of infrastructure offline before it might have done so anyway, helps you really recognize that there's an opportunity here to say, all right, let's just decide when these closures need to happen from a policy perspective, and that gives people potentially 10 years to plan for it. What we've seen in previous transitions is that those planning horizons really do help for communities, individuals, et cetera, to try to understand what the next steps look like a lot of the time. This is, again, just power, but you can do this with a lot of the other infrastructure we see too, just in thinking really concretely about what do we need to replace, what do we need to support as we really start thinking about retirements. The other pieces of this are a little harder. So when we think about transportation, this is something that falls under the 2050 goal, but transportation actually is a bigger contributor to US greenhouse gases now than power is. Just sort of a remarkable achievement in power sector decarbonization, although that's mostly coal to gas switching as opposed to entirely defossilization. But the transportation sector accounts for about 27% of emissions at this point and is about 90% reliant on oil. Another 7% or so comes from natural gas vehicles, and then that ethanol that gets blended in with gasoline, and a little bit of biodiesel that gets blended in with diesel. But at the end of the day, with transportation, only about 3% of the energy is anything other than those resources, and that includes electricity. So again, thinking back to that very small contribution by wind and solar, when you think about electric vehicles that we talk about a lot and kind of recognize as something that we need to look at for decarbonization, it's a really, really small base. With transportation, the retirements question starts to get really complex really quickly, not just because it's multiple things. So this is planes, it's boats, it's trains, but it's cars also. But very specifically because this is many, many pieces of infrastructure. It's like all this stuff is countable, but when we're talking about power plants, we're talking about a few thousand sites. With these, we're talking about hundreds of millions in the United States alone, and it's individual people's cars. So when you think about a 2050 deadline for full decarbonization, which probably mostly means electrification and possibly some remaking of the way we do transportation, so potentially denser cities, more public transit, more trains, these types of things are all within scope. You realize that 2050 is not that far away. So for example, and I have no idea how this is gonna go, but who here has driven a car after it was 10 years old? All right, yeah, I think I've got one that made it to 20, one that's like 18 right now. Even my EV is 10 years old. So that is kind of indicative, I think, of the point that if we're really serious about hitting 2050, you have to stop selling gasoline-fired cars at some point, right? Like, so if we're still selling gas cars in 2040, even 2030, that starts to become really, really hard to meet these targets. And so that date creeping back really, I think, drives home that 2050 is not that far away from an infrastructural perspective. It's kind of interesting to see that some states are starting to acknowledge this, and particularly the ones that have zero targets or net zero targets actually enshrined in law. So the United States doesn't have a legally binding target, but some states do. And like California, for example, is saying they're not going to sell oil-fired cars anymore after 2035. Those are the kinds of things that we actually do need to be pretty precise about and really be thinking about at this point, because it's much harder to take stuff off the road once it's there. This, kind of like with the power plants, helps you anticipate when things are going to be reaching end of life anyway, and that really helps you with phase outs. Another one, and probably in some ways the hardest one, is home heating. So this map comes from the Washington Post, but basically shows the most common type of home heating fuel across the country. The purples and reds are fossil fuels. The golds are electricity and wood. But what you can kind of immediately see from this chart is that cold places use fossil fuels for heating. There's kind of an obvious reason for that, which is that heating is very energy intensive. And in places where it gets cold enough that if you don't have heating, you will probably die in the winter, you really need to make sure that you have access to enough energy and immediately enough. When we talk about moving away from fossil fuels here, that's a really very difficult thing to do infrastructurally. So basically, in all these places that are using gas and oil, propane, those types of things, primarily for home heating, moving to an electric system is essentially the way that we anticipate that we could decarbonize home heating, but that puts extraordinary strain on the amount of electricity infrastructure we need. For intuition there, basically the thing that drives how big the electricity system needs to be right now is air conditioning load. Essentially because you have everyone turning on their air conditioner at the same time. Electricity is still not something that we store very well, so that means you have to have a lot of power plants that are able to all be on at once. That's basically why grids are the size they are now. If you talk about electrifying heat, you basically have the same problem, but now with a much bigger energy demand. For intuition there also, if you think about kind of the worst case scenario for air conditioning, maybe you're going from 110 degrees down to 70, it's a 40-degree range or so. With heating, you might be going from minus 30 to 60, like 90-degree range. And so it very quickly probably illustrates why this can be such a big infrastructural problem. Even though we're talking about moving largely to very, very efficient types of heating, so through heat pumps, things like this that are much more efficient than a lot of the essentially toaster ovens heating your house that we see in a lot of the yellow areas right now, this is a massive project. And again, if you do this poorly, people die. And so really thinking very carefully about what it means to facilitate that transition, to make sure that people have backups while we're still trying to understand how this works, all against the backdrop of learning how to operate a new decarbonized electricity system, all while learning how to do that with climate change on top of it. This is a hard problem. It's doable, but it really does kind of come down to individually at the asset level, thinking about what those transitions need to look like. So maybe a point that is probably not a surprise at this point, we have a lot to do. I want to also kind of highlight the amount of work that this is and the amount of infrastructure this is with something that I think even a lot of people that work on energy transitions don't think about this explicitly. But as we think about transitioning to clean energy, a lot of that does mean a transition to much more electricity use. Again, the reason for that is essentially that the zero carbon resources that we can access are things like wind, solar, and geothermal, which we basically use as electricity. It's a little hard to use directly. I have some quibbles with the way we count energy, like we use a ton of solar energy through windows and things like that, but at least in the stuff that is commercially bought and sold, this is electric. Therefore, in order to use those clean resources instead of fossil fuels, we need to talk about electricity. What this is showing is essentially a number of ranges of scenarios for net zero greenhouse gas economies put together by the Net Zero America project that Princeton put out a couple of years ago, suggesting that there's a bunch of different ways that you can get to net zero. But under all of those across their scenarios, what they see is that the electricity system basically goes from about 1 terawatt right now. The unit doesn't matter a ton, but it's about 1 of the big unit that we use, to somewhere between 2.5 and 6.5. That's a huge increase in electricity. And then thinking back to those earlier slides where wind and solar are these tiny things right now, to take the existing system that we have, it's actually not enough to go from that sort of 6% from wind and solar to replacing the electricity system we have. It's actually also making the electricity system much bigger. This is part of the reason why people are so concerned about transmission line capacity. It's not just that we need enough transmission line to accommodate what we're doing now. We actually also need to get this maybe 3 to 6 times as big as it is now and accommodate different kinds of resources in different kinds of locations, that sort of thing. One thing I do want to stress here is that this doesn't actually necessarily mean that the energy system is going to be more infrastructurally intensive. A lot of the ways that we use electricity are kind of inherently more efficient than the way that we use fossil fuels. So for example, heat pumps, they're using electricity to move heat from one kind of air to another kind of air instead of heating the air directly. It's actually very efficient to do that. Induction stoves, similarly, magnets heating things up is a lot more efficient than fire heating things up. EVs are inherently more efficient than combustion engine vehicles. All of that aside, we still end up in this place where we need a huge amount of electricity infrastructure. But simultaneously, as we think about phasing out fossil systems, we're also getting rid of a huge amount of infrastructure that supports those systems. So it's a massive project of both building and decommissioning at scales that we don't usually talk about. But I think that it is kind of useful to keep in mind that we're not just talking about kind of a one-to-one replacement. We're talking about a much bigger electricity system moving forward. So where do we go from here? This is kind of a busy chart as well, but I think one of the points that I kind of want to make clearly is that there are a lot of different ways that we can get to a decarbonized future. If the goal is just to get carbon out of the system, there's many, many strategies to do that, but they don't all necessarily have the same other types of impacts. This is going to be pretty quantitative and pretty focused on environmental impacts, but you can think about doing this for various kinds of social impacts, distributional justice, those types of things as well. But this is basically an excerpt from a paper that I did with a couple of peers on California's electricity system, focused on different ways of getting to a decarbonized grid and their impact on other kinds of things that we care about. So in this case, looking at cost, looking at critical minerals use, looking at metals use, looking at water use, and looking at land use. And what this shows essentially, the little bars on top are the baseline, 60% renewables, and the rest are full decarbonization of the California electricity system. Depending on what you're co-optimizing with carbon, you can actually end up in very, very different places in terms of resource intensity for other factors. So as an example, looking at this one focused on land use, you can end up in a system that uses a lot of wind and solar, that is very low water intensity, which is something that's pretty important in California, but it's very land intensive. On the other hand, you can do something that's a lot less land intensive that maybe relies a lot on geothermal, some nuclear, but you end up being quite water intensive in those circumstances. And so overall point here is just that we know where we need to go in terms of the carbon stuff, but there's also a lot of other things we want to keep paying attention to as well. This is, again, just the environmental pieces of it, but really thinking about what this means on the social side too is important. Another thing I really like about this paper that I'll just note as an aside is that all of the zero carbon scenarios we looked at ended up cheaper than the reference case, which is kind of counterintuitive, but is an interesting thing to say. We actually do have some room here. Like, it's not necessarily the case that things will continue to get cheaper forever. There are reasons why you might not believe that, but we're not talking about something that's massively, massively expensive, but it is a system that needs to be designed. Another thing that I think is really important to think about as we talk about infrastructure change is basically what we are relying on the existing fossil fuel infrastructure base to do going forward. So what this is a map of the transmission lines that move natural gas around the United States. This is just the big lines that are moving things in kind of bulk cases. If you put the distribution lines to everyone's house on here, the whole map would be red. So these are the big pipes. But basically, if you assume that the fossil fuel system is going to be there as a backup for you long term, that means you are also assuming the infrastructure is going to be there. There's a lot of modeling exercises that kind of suggest that maybe you can rely on the natural gas system to show up, 2% of the time in 2050 under really serious emergency conditions. And I think, again, as an infrastructure person and as a civil engineer, one of the things I'm really concerned about with a lot of those claims is the assumption that it makes about the infrastructure that's still there. Are we going to keep these many pipes around to use a system 2% of the time? Can we do that safely? Can we even do that at all, given pressure constraints and things like that? And so really thinking very carefully as we make assumptions about what's available for us when we're relying on things in emergency versus normal circumstances and such. I think really focusing on what that means for infrastructure intensity is something we need to focus on a lot more explicitly than we do now. As kind of an example of this, also not sure how this is going to go in this particular audience, but how many people have a fireplace in your house? How many of you feel comfortable using it? All right, so kind of more people have a fireplace than are comfortable using it. This is my fireplace. It's not something I feel comfortable using. It's 130 years old, and the chimney inspector basically told us you can open the flue one more time. Then it can be open or not. I moved from Atlanta last summer. We had 6 fireplaces in that house, and all of them had chimneys that had been cut off in the attic. So also not going to be using those. The point that I want to make with this example is basically that even infrastructure that used to work or that maybe works right now doesn't necessarily keep working if we don't maintain it and we don't decide that it's going to keep working. So hypothetically, if I don't have access to electricity or natural gas or other things that have been retrofitted into my house, I could use my chimneys. But in practice, that's not true, and I might not know that until I try. Same kind of idea where if 20 years from now, I'm trying to use a gas-fired power plant in an emergency, and I haven't turned it on in 20 years, and I don't still have a contract with somebody to provide me gas, no one's inspected the pipes in years, it's probably not a good idea for me to assume that's going to be there at the most difficult time a system is going to experience. And so this is essentially the crux of, as Sunshine was introducing earlier, something that I and my co-author Sarah Hastings-Simon have been talking about as the mid-transition, where you really need to be very careful about what you're assuming each system is bringing when you have a fossil system that's getting smaller and a clean system that's getting bigger. They're both constraining each other because neither one's quite big enough to do everything on its own, but they're both too big to avoid constraining each other. But really being careful to coordinate what you're expecting under what circumstances from which infrastructures becomes really critically important here. All right, so for our last few minutes, and then I hope we have some time for questions, I want to talk a little bit about what justice looks like in the transition context. This is an old iron mill in Pennsylvania, and I bring this image up a lot in this context just to kind of show that we do have some experience with big transitions out of specific industries. And essentially, the concept of a just transition, if you've heard that term, really comes from a labor perspective, originating with the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic International Workers Union in terms of thinking about what happens to jobs and what happens to the people that held those jobs when entire industries kind of get regulated out of existence, often for environmental reasons. So when we started thinking a lot more carefully about toxic chemicals, for example, the people that worked in those industries were like, hey, we need to talk about what happens to us. Like, we're here, we're fulfilling this role, but something has got to happen. With the fossil transition, we talk about just transition quite frequently in the context of what happens to fossil fuel workers. And there, again, it's hundreds of thousands of people, essentially, a smaller number than a lot of people think. But those are jobs where you do actually need people to do them until you definitely don't anymore, which sounds kind of obvious, but you actually do need kind of the A-team to stay on the line until the very last day that you're using a piece of infrastructure. These are networked, high-hazard industries that require quite a lot of training to work in. But I think one of the other things that's really important to remember here is that when we talk about justice in the transition, obviously people that are affected by decarbonization and kind of the transition of these particular industries need to have some attention paid to them, but they're not the only ones. These are industries that have affected all of us through climate change and a number of other things. And when we think about justice, really focusing on just general human thriving, human dignity, human safety for everyone, actually, I think needs to be a very core way that we imagine how we're remaking these systems. So, workers, again, very important, and I'll get into that in a minute. But this, for example, is not even a climate change map. This is from the Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Justice Screening Tool. It basically shows a long history of air toxics that are associated oftentimes with fossil projects, not always, but oftentimes with fossil projects that have affected fence-line communities for decades in very specific ways, often in pretty racialized patterns. And something that, honestly, I pulled the air toxics respiratory for this map, but the map looks basically the same for a lot of other types of impacts. These are things that, in addition to climate change, are really heavily affecting people. This is New York last week. We know that climate change affects everybody. We know that justice in a transition really needs to accommodate that. We know we need to deal with compensation, probably, loss and damages. Again, thinking about most affected people in areas, there are many, many people that are deeply affected by these problems that didn't do much to cause them and have very little resourcing to respond because of very long-term patterns of injustice. We cannot think about a just transition as being purely focused on the fossil industries themselves, instead of on everyone affected by climate change. And so I kind of want to acknowledge that, because a lot of the time when we talk about just transition in the labor context, it sounds like, we're making sure that all the fossil fuel workers have a pension, but what about everybody else? That said, there is, I think, a pretty important reason to not focus on fossil fuel industry workers as getting more than other people and not as being sort of differentially allowed to have justice served, but we do actually need to pay attention to what it means to transition these industries while having people still working in them. This is kind of maybe a salient example. This is Texas from the freeze in 2021, basically showing a natural gas wellhead pipe system frozen up. This led to a cascading impact where a lot of failures in the gas system essentially caused people not to have heat for days. Some people died. It was a big problem, and largely because the fossil fuel system wasn't operating as expected. I'm not saying that this is because of transition. It's largely not in that case, but this is the kind of thing that we might imagine happening if we're not very attentive to exactly what's going on with these systems as they get disinvested, as they get older, and as we get into more and more challenging operational conditions where we're mostly relying on these systems to appear under the most challenging circumstances. So thinking about how do we create structures that not only remake our energy system to focus on justice for everybody, but also create space to have people even probably still entering some of these industries, knowing that they're going to go away before people are ready to retire potentially, is actually something I do think we need to pay some differential attention to. Not, again, because fossil workers deserve more compensation or more opportunity to thrive, but because we actually do need people working in these industries, even as we're saying they're being phased out. Another example, this is line 32, Pacific Gas and Electric, which is the same line that killed 8 people in San Bruno in 2010 when it blew up in a neighborhood because it hadn't been maintained, essentially. And again, kind of making that point, you need people to be maintaining these things, even as there's less and less money in the system. They're getting older, those types of things. Probably because we're talking about out to 2050, and this is already an aging labor force. That means bringing more people into the fossil industries, but again, recognizing that they're being phased out as fast as we can. That's a really difficult tension, and it's part of the reason why the just transition conversation is so explicit. But again, justice in the transition, in addition to the just transition around labor, are kind of two parts of a much bigger conversation. Another part of the reason why this is hard is because even though we're moving to, again, a massive amount of infrastructure build out, huge opportunities, probably quite labor intensive actually. Personally, I get a little nervous sometimes at how labor intensive this might be. We don't generally talk about having a lot of jobs as a bad thing, but when you start to scale things up to 80 times as big as they are now, there's potentially some challenges there. But a lot of the jobs associated with the kinds of industries that we're moving to are not necessarily in the same places as the jobs that are being eliminated. This is a map of the wind resource in the United States, basically showing that a lot of that resource is in the middle of the country. But notably, and again, given this point that we actually need to make the electricity system much, much bigger than it's been in the past, there's a huge amount of opportunity for this to be viable pretty much everywhere, even if it's not the ideal resource condition. Same thing goes with solar. New Jersey, even before a lot of the big cost declines of the last 10 years or so in solar, has been a solar leader. I saw a ton of solar panels on my way down from Boston this morning. Like, you can do solar in light yellow places. And we need so much infrastructure that probably means there are more opportunities for ongoing energy industries, even in places that are moving from fossil to not. But all of this raises a lot of questions about resource allocation. Like, should the places that have already been able to benefit from energy production be continuing to do that, even though there's other places that maybe are waiting their turns? But overall point, we need a lot of infrastructure, so there's probably a lot of opportunities here. Similarly, there's a huge amount of remediation work that is actually very well locationally matched with a lot of the fossil jobs that we see now. So this is an acid mine drainage site out of a coal mine in West Virginia. This is kind of an older coal mine. Most of the new mines that have been built over the last couple of decades don't usually do this, but this is something that you see through a lot of Appalachia. I was working in West Virginia back in the kind of late 2000s and met a few people that were like, I didn't know water wasn't this color until I was like 15 and went to the city. It's a huge problem, but it also represents this huge, huge opportunity for people to invest in their own communities using their same kinds of skill sets in places that have been affected by fossil industries. Megan Milliken Bivin has proposed an abandoned well administration that focuses on essentially taking oil and gas wells as they're getting to end of life and hiring the people that worked in those industries to transition them and then remediate them. Similar thing where there's a ton of remediation work potentially in very well-matched locational places. And then the other one, and one of my favorites, is kind of, again, going back to this point that heating and cooling are big drivers of how much electricity infrastructure we need. Really efficient buildings can help with that and also allow you to stay safe even when the power's not on. So focusing on making people's homes safe and efficient is something that helps us on the human welfare side, it helps us on an infrastructure intensity side, and kind of definitionally provides local jobs because the houses are where people live. Just to kind of bring this point home too, this is a study showing, I know I was talking mostly about heating, but this is a study of cooling that essentially shows that when you make buildings very efficient, you can improve their ability to provide essentially what's called passive survivability, which means that you can survive when you don't have power, water, those types of things, in ways that are actually really meaningful from a climate perspective. So much more efficient buildings are safer in summers in the mid-century, for example. And you can do things like put together policies that really give people actionable information. So this is the signing of Illinois's Climate and Energy Jobs Act a couple of years ago, which I think is one of the only ones in the country that says, this is the date we're going to close this infrastructure and this is how we're going to get there. But again, this focus on really getting people opportunities where they are with very actionable timelines and those types of things are pretty encouraging, I would say. So to close, as we think about transition, I think the core question is essentially, what does it look like to thrive under climate change, during the transition, all those types of things, to really start from the question of what do people actually need and how do we provide that? One of the kind of nice things about this is that we generally know what people need. We need shelter, we need healthcare, we need leisure. So starting from those kinds of questions can really help us design programs as we're completely remaking one of the most significant infrastructure systems that supports our society. We have a huge opportunity to actually make some of these choices and design it in from the beginning. And ongoingly really thinking about what does the future look like? Where are we trying to get? And given that I'm starting from that endpoint, what do I need to be doing now to get to a vision where people are thriving is, again, I think one of the bigger opportunities that we're going to have for a while to really think carefully about this structurally. So with that, I will just end on saying the energy transition is really a historic opportunity to achieve both justice and sustainability. And again, I thank you very much for spending part of your afternoon with me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grubert. That was a really incredibly informative and enlightening talk. So we're nearly out of time, so we're going to take just a couple of questions. And so I am looking around. Kavitha. So do we have someone with a mic? Yes, please. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. Something that I think we don't always explicitly talk about in these conversations is the way in which capitalism has shaped and driven the energy system that we have today. Something that one of our other fellows brought up during our sessions was like oil and gas companies wield an enormous amount of power and aren't looking to willingly put themselves out of business. So I wonder if you have broad thoughts on what an energy transition looks like within capitalism, against capitalism, parallel to it. How does that work?
That's the question, right? Yeah, and in a lot of ways, the profit motive makes transition extraordinarily difficult. I think that's exactly right. And I think it's one of the reasons why really focusing on regulatory approaches as opposed to financial incentives to maybe nudge one way or the other tend to be where I land. I will shout out a couple of colleagues' work recently that have really been thinking about public acquisition processes and what it means to take over some of these infrastructures in a way that can be guided to a planned transition, essentially, without having basically all of the profits be privatized and all of the liabilities be socialized, which is essentially what we do now. The way transition has happened to date is essentially that places go bankrupt and then their liabilities become public. This is a very, very common story in the coal industry in particular. Just reading an excellent article today about how this is happening with gas stations as well. But yeah, I think assuming that a company with a profit motive is going to do this without another structure is not working. We've been trying that for 30 or 40 years and it hasn't really been happening. And so yeah, it's a really, really hard conversation, but I think that the pathway probably has to include a lot more government intervention.
Question in the back.
Thanks so much. When you looked at the scale of the project you outlined and the urgency, and then you looked at that slide that you talked about, the kind of relative impact on land, water, materials, metals via different strategies, that's like a perfect optimization kind of scenario. There is maybe a good way to approach it and a bad way. And yet, to the earlier question, with capitalism, it's all about profit. So I guess the question is, what's the appetite for optimizing a good solution that can happen in the reasonable amount of time that we have so that we get to the end with it before it's too late, you know?
Yeah, no, I kind of hate being this guy, but in some ways, some of this probably is too late for an actual optimal pathway. That said, from where we sit now, I think we really need to have a very hard conversation about how we make decisions. And that, again, probably looks like a much bigger regulatory apparatus. It probably looks like a much broader conversation about values that we have as a society that we are trying to achieve. My personal feeling is that this has to start with a lot of very universal programs focused on people's well-being first, because a lot of the tension that we see as we get to some of these conversations about the technical stuff, like how much water do you get to use, how much metals do you have to mine or stuff, oftentimes really starts from people asking, what's going to happen to my healthcare? How am I going to feed my family? Those are problems that are potentially necessary conditions to solve before we can really build up enough trust to have that conversation about other things.
All about profit, so like you don't have the conversation.
Right, like, and again, I think there is a huge structural shift that a lot of this entails, but as we talk about it now, there's kind of we're gonna get to net zero, and then how is not really discussed. But yeah, like, this is a seismic shift in the way that we govern our institutions. It's a seismic shift in ownership conversations. And I think my goal a lot of the time, because it's not something where you have just an easy solution to say, look, if we do this, everything's fine, that works very nicely within our political system, is to really say, the things that we are proposing here are not compatible with each other, and we have to have a hard conversation now. This is not something where there's probably going to be a really easy win, but what we are saying we are doing and what we have the capacity to achieve with the kinds of infrastructures and the kinds of governance structures that we have now are not going to get there. Let's actually talk specifically and physically about what we need to do.
Last question right here.
So I'm from Louisiana, and we have 21 companies so far, maybe 23 by today, that have announced plans for carbon capture, sequestration, injection of carbon underground into deep wells, and new pipelines to deal with that. That will be as extensive as those pipelines that you showed in your slide. But at the same time, we have a state political organization that is attempting to continue to promote traditional oil and gas production. So where do we go from here in terms of trying to cut through some of the of that to actually get to getting things done?
Yeah, that's also a really challenging question. And in Louisiana specifically, I think that there are a lot of very good arguments for why some of those proposals are probably not compatible with longer term goals. It's a really, I think with carbon management in general, both mitigatively, like on something that's going to continue to create emissions, and then on the removal side, there's a really important conversation that we need to have about where that needs to be applied, because there isn't another option. I think a lot of the projects that are being proposed right now, kind of to the earlier point, are a little bit more because this is a profitable pathway potentially. Not that that is something that may have never worked, but at this point, I think really having the conversation about could you be doing something different? If no, let's talk about how to do this safely is more needed than maybe we're having. A lot of the focus on doing carbon capture on like coal plants or refineries or things that kind of presume a long-term fossil engagement with the energy system, I have a lot of questions about what that looks like beyond 5 or 10 years from now, if that.
Much work to do. I would like to start, though, by thanking Emily for this really great lecture. As a reminder, we still have 2 more lectures the next 2 Thursdays in this year's series. So if you're interested, you can visit metcalfinstitute.org to register for those. They'll both be online only, not in person. And by the way, have you ever seen a better argument for journalists who know how to cover science and engineering? I have not. So if you're inspired to make a gift, please visit metcalfinstitute.org to do so, or grab an envelope on your way out. I'd also like to note, just before we adjourn, for all the Metcalf fellows and alumni who are here and advisory board members, past and present, if you would exit out this way, out to the quad directly, we're going to take a photo. So all of those folks, if you could move this way, we would very much appreciate it. And everyone else, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here.